Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here for Living the Wildlife. I wanted to talk today about deer mice, because deer mice are a species of animal that are frequently ignored in the conversations about commensal rodents. Deer mice are more common than people give them credit for, and they are rather ubiquitous. So I wanted to sort of give a synopsis of a really fine article by Dr. Gary W. Whitmer and Rachel S. Moulton. They wrote an article, Deer Mice, Peromyscus Species, Biology, Damage, and Management, a review that was published in the 25th Proceedings, or I should say the Proceedings of the 25th Vertebrate Pest Conference, published in 2012. And these were pages 213 through 219. And what they did was they summarized the research that they were aware of up to this particular point. So it was pretty neat what they did. So the reality is that these animals are far more common, as I noted, than people realize, and they're often ignored in the training, and I wanted to sort of fill that gap today. So they're both rodents, of course, and we want to talk about two different species. One of them is called the deer mouse. That's Peromyscus maniculatus. And then we also have the white-footed mouse, which is sometimes mistakenly called the white-footed deer mouse. That would be incorrect. It's the white-footed mouse, and that's Peromyscus leucopus. Both of them have extensive ranges in the United States. The deer mouse has a broader range, but for our purposes today, we're going to combine them and treat them as a unit because they both share similar characteristics. I mean, they're not identical, obviously, but they're, for our purposes, for pest control, they're close enough. And so I wanted to talk a little about some of their biology in this regard. So I wanted to begin discussing some of their biology, and so we're going to talk about how big they are and that sort of thing. So let's get started with that. So deer mice, vary in size according to this particular article, and they can be anywhere between 15 and 30 grams, which is, for our purposes, half an ounce to a little more than an ounce in weight. Their total length, now whenever you read the literature and it says total length, they mean from the tip of the nose all the way to the tip of the tail. It's total length. If they talk about body length, then it would just be the tip of the nose to the, basically to their butt. It's how they would measure the animal. So this is total length, and we're looking at about 130 to 200 millimeters, which would be about 5 inches to a little over 7.5 inches. And I'm sort of, rounding off those numbers there a little bit to make it more memorable. So you identify deer mice separate from house mice by looking at their eyes. The deer mice eyes are bigger than the house mouse. These are nocturnal animals, just like house mice, but deer mice are spending their time, of course, outdoors typically, although they can do pretty well in structures as well. And they also have larger ears than house mice. And then they also have, most characteristically, a sharp bifurcation between the stomach fur, which is typically white, and the back fur, called the dorsal area, which is typically like deer-like coloration or tannish coloration. Where the house mouse the change between the dorsal area, the back, to the stomach tends to be much more gradual as it gradually changes in coloration. For deer mice, it's like someone just drew a sharp line. Like it's like you're coloring as a kid. You're coloring within the lines. And so it goes brown to white instantly. And the bicolored tail, it can be quite stark. So that's how you're going to help you quickly identify that you're dealing with deer mice. You can't really do it on the basis of scat, although some people think that you could. You really need to sort of trap some and make sure that you are dealing with deer mice, because the scat is going to be similar in size, and you probably don't have enough experience to be able to distinguish them in the field setting, and I think there'd be a lot of variability there. Now, they have a pretty high reproductive rate. I mean, it's certainly going to be similar to that of house mice. So they can have anywhere from 1 to 9 pups as a female, and typically for females in northern regions, they're going to be mating, primarily having pups between March and October. In warmer climates, they can be mating year-round. So you have to be sure you understand that there's going to be a difference between the northern tier of the United States and the southern tier of the United States, because deer mice can be found from the coastal areas to the alpine areas to above to valleys to deserts to urban areas. I used to live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I had deer mice in my house, and I lived literally in the middle of the city. So we had deer mice there. So don't just assume if you're in an urban area. Lincoln was about 275,000 people, to kind of give you an idea how big the city was. We were in the middle, and we had deer mice. So don't think that you're only going to be dealing with house mice in urban areas. It's simply not true. Deer mice like to live underground. They're not great diggers, but they do like living in areas below ground. They will also nest above ground as well, so they can climb, and they typically line their nests with large quantities of plants, shredded materials. It could be twigs, roots, grasses, and they will also use feathers, shredded cloth to line their nests. So the females will have anywhere from 3 to 4 litters per year, and you can have generally up to 4 generations produced in 1 year. If all of them achieved maximum survival, and again, that's very unusual in nature, so we're talking about what the upper limit could be. You could have 10,000 young in 1 year, because you're going to have the young maturing and then having young, and then they're having young, and then they're having young. But again, that would be highly unusual, of course, and I doubt we would ever be in a situation with that level of perfection. But that kind of gives you an idea of what they could do if everything was perfect and ideal and you didn't have, predation and disease mortality. But it's an interesting number to know. They will share nests with each other, so researchers have found that 13 mice can be found huddled together. Females, though, that are in estrus, that means they're ready to mate, will get a little bit more belligerent and fight for their territory, so they will probably, because they're getting ready to mate and have young, and so they get a little bit more antsy. How large is their home range? In other words, we know that house mice, we're looking at, 30 feet typically of their home range. Probably can be larger, but deer mice are going to have a larger home range because, again, this is a native species of the United States, where the house mouse isn't. So the deer mice can live out in the wild with no problem whatsoever. They can also live with humans without much difficulty either. So how large are their home range? Well, of course, it depends on how much available food there is, and that can be anything from 1/10 of a hectare. Now, a hectare is 2.2 acres. So to give you an idea of how large of an area that could be, that'd be what we would call 1/4 of an acre. And their home range can be as big as 1 hectare, which would be about 2.2 acres. So how far do they travel? Well, some research that was done in Nebraska actually found that they can travel about 100 meters, which would be about almost 110 yards. So significantly larger mobility than what would be typical of house mouse. And that was a sugar beet field if you're looking for what their habitat was when that study was being done. When we're also looking here at how they operate in terms of their diet, they are omnivores, so they will eat a broad array of food sources. That could be everything from nuts and berries and fruits to insects to carrion. That's a dead animal material. Fungi, bones, they'll gnaw on bones, of course. Eggs, various plants, and their seeds. And so what they really love, however, is they love seeds. And they will cache, but their caching hasn't really been known to really help plant production per se. So, but they do cache seeds, and some of the seeds that they cache are those of the ragweed plant, the panic grass, sorrel, tick, trefoil, apple, cherry, Douglas fir, and acorns from an oak tree. So they have a little bit of diversity there. What kind of damage can they do? Well, they can certainly hinder reproduction work that's been done in forests. They can certainly cause impacts on seed regeneration, which makes sense because they're actually eating seeds. If they're eating the seeds, then the tree can't grow, obviously. They can also do some other damage. I believe I had a nest of deer mice in my house when I was back in Lincoln, where they actually just climbed a pole because a vine was using it, and then they basically put a nest in the corner of my attic. And it was a pretty large nest. It was it filled probably one of those trash can bags that you would use in your office, for instance. It would fill those. So it was quite large in that. Agricultural crops can also be impacted, of course. Deer mice have been causing damage to almond orchards, and so what you need to understand about this is that when you're trying to poison them, if you're trying to control this particular species, you got to make sure that, of course, deer mice are on the pesticide label, but also realize if you're in a situation where there's a lot of favored foods, they're going to be eating their favorite foods and not your bait. And so if you think you're going to poison your way necessarily to success in difficult accounts, then you have something else coming for you. You really need to be thinking more substantively about habitat modification, which is removal of food sources, hardening that structure by doing exclusion, which is something that many pest control operators unfortunately are not doing for their clients. Even simple jobs, which I think is terrible. I think that it's not that much money, and that should be done. And you also want to be thinking of traps as well. We do know that deer mice will predate on birds, and they will do some damage, of course, there on eggs, and even predate on nestlings, which is kind of troubling. You may go online and actually see that even house mice have done this in certain island communities where they've put up trail cameras and watched certain bird nests and watched house mice attack those nestlings. It can be quite disturbing. But for our purposes, what we're mostly concerned about, of course, is how deer mice are entering into structures. And of course, they want, like any small rodent, they want to go to a place where it's warm, and what better place than a building? They will eat the bird seed, they will eat the pet food, so it's important to keep those things stored properly. What is also important to understand is that deer mice are associated with two key diseases, and that is the hantavirus, of course, as well, and also Lyme disease. So they are part of the Lyme disease cycle. So as a structural pest controller or a wildlife control operator, it's critical that you, whenever you're in an area where you're seeing a lot of droppings, you know that there's going to be urine there as well that you can't see. And if you're stirring all that up, you could be inhaling hantavirus into your lungs and come down with that particular infection. Thankfully, it's not a common infection. However, if you get it, there is a 30 to 40% mortality. And so I'm not going to talk about how to protect yourself per se on hantavirus at this point, but I am going to encourage you to go to the CDC, that's the Centers for Disease Control, and read the information about what to do about hantavirus. Now, Lyme disease, of course, what you want to be concerned for there is the ticks. And so where you have deer mice, you can also have ticks. So you want to be thinking about, you're walking around tall grass, you want to make sure you're doing tick checks, you want to make sure you're looking at how you're removing those ticks. The CDC will have additional information on that as well. So again, we never want to hype the fear on disease, especially with our clients. We don't want to create that kind of a crisis. However, you as the professional need to be sure that you are understanding how you protect yourself. And so you're going to be wearing your HEPA filter. You should be wearing your Tyvek suit when you're going into crawl spaces. Whenever you're going into enclosed areas, you should be wearing that respirator. Properly fitted. If you got a beard, the beard's got to go. Unless your mask is able to seal against the skin in such a manner that you don't have to worry about that seal problem. So learn to protect yourself. Thankfully, bleach, 10% bleach solution kills the hantavirus, and of course time will kill the hantavirus. So this is one infection that will go away over time. Where is this going to be most important for people to be aware of? And that is areas that are undisturbed for long periods of time. So I'm in Montana, and we have a surprisingly high amount of hantavirus infections. For the size and population of our state, we only have 1.2 million people in the entire state. So why would that be? Well, because a lot of people have cabins in our state. It's absolutely gorgeous, and they leave it empty in the wintertime. Of course, the rodents love being there. We have deer mice across the entire length of the state. So an owner comes back in the spring, opens up the building, and they realize, there's droppings on the floor perhaps, and maybe they're sweeping instead of mopping, and then they can expose themselves to that active virus, and then they come down with this illness, and it's quite serious. One can only imagine how many infections occur where people recover and they never bother. They think they have the flu or something. So be careful. We don't want to hype it, because this is something you can easily protect yourself with. So how do we control this particular animal? Well, you control it just like mice. So you want to do your habitat modification. You want to do your exclusion of the building. You want to control the food availability. You want to set traps. And of course, you want to be able to use your toxins. You want to take that multifaceted approach to controlling the species, and you can get good success. So what kind of baits can you use if you're using baits? Well, you simply use peanut butter, of course. Make sure you're watching out for peanut butter allergies for your clients. Don't pull out the Skippy jar. Make sure you repackage your peanut butter. I recommend putting it into a different color, putting green coloration into it so people don't know. They may suspect what it is. And, there must be peanut butter in there. Yep, there could be. But you want to make it look different than your Skippy peanut butter. Repackage it so you don't pull out a Skippy jar. It's just not professional, and it's insulting to your clients. Sunflower seeds, of course, are always a big hit. Make sure when you're using traps with seeds, make sure they're not visible to birds, because birds will be attracted, and then you end up killing birds. Your regular snap traps are going to work fine for your deer mice. Just again, make sure you're wearing your you're wearing your gloves, you're avoiding contact with the urine and feces, because that could be infected with the hantavirus there. So make sure you read that literature at the CDC to learn how to handle that. Again, you can also use toxicants. Just be sure that you are paying attention to the label to make sure that deer mice are listed on the label. I would encourage people to be thinking about first-generation anticoagulants before you turn to second-generation anticoagulants. So that would be your warfarin, chlorphacinone, diphacinone, because you can have a lower impact on non-target species in secondary poisoning. Of course, if you want to really reduce that risk, you can use things like zinc phosphide, which of course has an extraordinarily high initial toxicity, but the secondary poisoning is extraordinarily low. There seems to be some indication that cocalciferol has a very low secondary poisoning rate. I'd have to do a little bit more reading on that. I'm not really convinced with some of the literature that I've been looking at presently, but it seems like it's a lower risk, and so I can certainly say that. But I'm not sure cocalciferol is labeled for deer mice, so make sure you check your label. But treat it like deer mice, like your house mouse, except understand that their home range is going to be significantly higher, and you have that significant disease issue that you don't have to the same extent as you do with house mice. And house mice certainly have their own diseases, but the key for you and your client is that hantavirus to be careful of. Well, I hope this has been helpful for you. This is Stephen Van Tassel for Wildlife Control Consultant. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.